Tonight. Cross Question coming up next. Joining me here in the studio, Ailbhe Rea, host of the Westminster Insider podcast and contributing writer at the New Statesman. Denise Headley, broadcaster, commentator and host of the Headley Highlight. Benedict Spence is also here, journalist and political commentator who's written regularly for outlets including the Telegraph, the Independent and the Spectator. And Whelan is to my left, columnist for Spiked magazine. Get your questions coming in. 0345 6060 973, the number to call. You can tweet at LBC or text on 84850.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
Just before we get into your calls on this, lots of them coming. There are still slots. 0345 6060 973. Want to get the panel's reaction to the breaking news story tonight. David Trimble's death. The former Northern Irish First Minister has passed away. Breaking news. Let's first go to Ailbhe. Ailbhe, your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, being Belfast born and bred, it's quite nice actually that I'm on your show right after the news of his passing, because really I'm sort of obviously of a generation that doesn't have much memory of his involvement in politics, but really benefited from that. You know, he had this long political career, but everything he'll be remembered for today will really be his achievement in brokering the Good Friday Agreement. He started off his political career as really quite a hardliner, and it's really just we're kind of indebted to him in Northern Ireland, whatever community you come from, that when the opportunity for peace came, he took it. It made him quite unpopular with parts of the unionist community, but I sit before you today as one of these people who grew up in Northern Ireland not hearing a bomb going off, not knowing what it feels like to be searched when you go into a shop. And I think, you know, this is one of the greats of Northern Irish political history, really. Even though he was a controversial character, I think we owe him a great deal.
Hello, this is a man, I was right, this is a man with an enormous political legacy.
Yes, an enormous political legacy, and it's a tragedy for his family that he's died. But I think, you know, for those of us who come from a different political perspective, perhaps someone like me who comes from a Irish Republican background, the question of the legacy of the Good Friday Agreement, I think the question is questionable, because the effect of democracy in the north of Ireland has been pretty, there's been stagnation in politics for a very long time, partly because of the power sharing agreement that the Good Friday Agreement enforces. Ailbhe's absolutely right that the immediate success of it was that bombs weren't going off, and I don't think anybody disputes the fact that that was a positive. But in terms of the future of maybe an Irish border poll or something like that, the Good Friday Agreement is constantly used by politicians as a block on any kind of possibility of that in the future. So yes, David Trimble played a particular role, a very central role in securing that. But I think there are significant numbers of people in Ireland who understand that the Good Friday Agreement has not been the kind of blessed sacrament that it's made out to be.
Benedict, on that, you were nodding along there. David Trimble, Lord Trimble, has died with clearly Northern Ireland in a much better place than for much of his life, but still with real issues, particularly around the Assembly and the Executive, to still be addressed.
Though I would say it's a great tragedy, obviously, for his family and for Irish politics, Northern Irish politics in general. But I would say, given where we are right now, with a war going on in Europe, for so long, what we often heard in political commentary around this country's relationship with the European Union, what the European Union had done was that there was no conflict, there was no war in Europe. And of course, that very conveniently ignored the Balkans. And it did also ignore the political insurgencies in places like Northern Ireland, also in the Basque Country and elsewhere. In Italy, for example, a great deal of political violence in the 70s and the 80s. And I think it sort of brings home, whilst there is a real war going on right now in Europe, I think it must make us all reflect on the value of diplomacy, of negotiations, and sometimes of very imperfect political outcomes, because often that is infinitely preferable to a situation where innocent people are dying on the streets every day. And so I think we have to look at the legacy of that period and look at it as a very imperfect one, but certainly far better than it was possibly before our time.
And on that, Denise, do you think there's a sense to which people will look at people like Lord Trimble, compare them to our current crop of politicians on all sides of the divide, both sides of the House of Commons, and say you just don't get them like that anymore?
I think so. I mean, I thought the point that Benedict was making was really an important one about diplomacy, especially given where we are at the moment, but also the point that was made previously about people's lived experience post the Good Friday Agreement. So I think in terms of the calibre and the, what I would call almost like the moral fortitude, I don't think they make them in that mould anymore.
Thank you, Denise. Let's get straight to your call, shall we? 0345 6060 973, the number to call. Michael is in Hampton. Michael, you want to ask about something we've been talking about a few minutes ago. Fire away.
Yes, what benefits if a Labour government will give at the moment where we've got things that really are out of the government's control, i.e. the war, the increase in energy costs, and just come out of a pandemic. Will the Labour Party be able to do something about the 10 or 11% inflation if they get to power? Will they be able to do anything about talking to Putin about trying to get the some negotiations going? And from my experience, governments where you've got full employment are very rarely kicked out.
Ella?
Will the Labour Party be able to do anything differently? Yes and no. I mean, it is a possibility. I really don't buy, I understand where Michael's coming from, but I really don't buy this idea, particularly when it comes out of government ministers' mouths, that there's not very much we can do because, over to the left is the war in Ukraine, over to the right is the pandemic, and, my hands are in the air, my hands are tied. That's the kind of line you get from politicians too often, and that's not true. If you think about, in relation to something like the pandemic, I mean, very few people predicted what was going to happen in Ukraine. But if you think about something like the pandemic, at the start, being taken by surprise is fair enough. But then you had 2 years of political decisions made by a government backed up by an opposition. The Labour Party didn't, suggest anything different to what Boris Johnson was doing. In fact, if anything, they wanted harder and stricter lockdowns. Those political decisions have had an impact economically, socially, and the fact remains that the Labour Party, in terms of the kind of economics of the pandemic, wanted to keep, schools closed for longer. They wanted to keep people off work for longer. They wanted they were constantly pushing for stricter restrictions. And if you're going to come along and say that the last 2 years have had an impact on the economy, or that, Rishi Sunak has screwed up, which, by the way, I think, it's pretty clear that he has. I'm certainly not a fan of the Tory party either. You're going to have to be able to prove that your track record said something different. And I think it's very clear to most people that, the space between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party at the moment is thinner than a Rizla paper, in terms of policy, in terms of vision, in terms of kind of the practicalities of what it takes to boost an economy. There is no big ideas floating
Is that
around
because
anymore.
the Tories have drifted to the left, or because Labour's drifted to the right?
I think it's because they're both drifting in space nowhere. I mean, because there is literally no politics with a big P happening at the moment. In the Conservative Party, you have a kind of pathetic row over taxes. Taxes are important and everything, and but it's not a solution. Scraping a few pennies from here or there is not a solution to an economic crisis that has been decades in the making. And what does the Labour Party? The Labour Party is currently having an internal spat over whether or not it's going to nationalise things, and the rest of us are sat at home thinking, Jesus Christ, I'm facing bills of up to £3,500 come the winter. Could somebody maybe have some kind of vision here and put something different on the table? It's a very depressing picture at the moment.
Ailbhe, Ella says they're all the same. Keir Starmer and whoever the next leader is would obviously reject that. Who's right in your view?
I mean, I would think it's kind of incorrect to say that there's no difference between them, or that there's no big politics happening. I think actually, I agree with Ella that there's a bit of a failure, or huge failure, in the Tory leadership contest to address the concerns of ordinary people right now. Certainly, it's this sort of strange disconnect, taxes between Rishi and Liz, and then sort of worrying about bills around the country. But that is real politics going on. This question about taxes, it isn't just a few pennies. I think, regardless of your view on it, what Liz Truss is proposing, like a massive programme of tax cuts and deregulation, would be a huge political risk, would be like a big move to the right in terms of the Conservative Party's economic agenda. And then Rishi Sunak is making the counter case for fiscal headroom and balancing the books, and that's big politics, really. And same really with the debate of Republic ownership. Whatever you think of it, or how relevant it is to the wider concerns of voters right now, that sort of pitch that Labour is making, trying to move on from just talking about renationalising and investment and talking more about growth and investment in business and trying to move on from the Corbyn years. That's also big politics. You know, we're seeing this shift really from the hard left perspective of the Jeremy Corbyn years and really Keir Starmer dragging his party towards the centre. We're seeing these shifts in both parties at the moment. I think it is really interesting.
Do you think Labour's doing enough? The question was about Ella saying effectively Keir Starmer's not distinguishing himself enough. Michael, our caller, says I doesn't seem to know what Labour would really do if it got power. Keir Starmer needs to do more on that, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, I think that if you speak to people close to Keir Starmer, they would see step one of his project as just distinguishing himself from Jeremy Corbyn. And then really it's like when you have the time of the platform of a general election campaign that you then distinguish yourself from your Conservative opposition when you actually have the airtime for that. Because the problem in opposition is that really it's just such a challenge to cut through, that Labour do release policies all the time, even if they're not terribly inspiring. We get them in our inboxes, just as boring press releases, but they don't really cut through when they're not shifting decisions at the moment. I would say that Keir Starmer has effectively done step one. No one on this panel, I would say, thinks that he's similar to Jeremy Corbyn, and I think the voters understand that too, and I think that was their absolute priority, moving on from that era, whatever you thought of it, trying to sort of distinguish from that, and I think get in particular with the announcements that we saw today to help voters get over this perception that they couldn't trust Labour with the economy under Jeremy Corbyn, that they liked his ideas but they worried that it wouldn't be affordable. The message that we heard from Rachel Reeves today was, don't worry, whatever we do, we'll definitely be able to afford it. If anything, it might be a bit restrained, it might be less inspiring, but you can trust us with the economy. They're really, really shifting the message.
Denise, is that what voters want? Pragmatism, a hard-headed approach, or do they want to feel a bit more excited? Albert talks about Jeremy Corbyn. His policies did grab the headlines in a way that Keir Starmer's aren't. But do you think Keir Starmer's right to try to move away from that and get back to some sort of more sensible ground?
I think the difficulty for Keir Starmer was that he lost, or not he lost, but the Labour Party lost so horrendously.
Jeremy Corbyn, yeah.
Exactly. So that is the key issue. It's to move from failure to electability. And that's his job, essentially. So today, when he made those announcements, he talked mainly about growth. And I don't think that the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are that close together, because on the cost of living issue, they put down an early day motion to say, look, you know, can you do something for ordinary working people? It didn't go very far, but I don't think it's a case of they're completely, not completely at odds. So I think essentially that they have to move themselves to the centre ground, yes, but they also have to be inspiring, because people want a vision. And I think at the moment they're not providing that type of vision. I think growth is important, but if you're going to, my headpiece has fallen out, but if you're going to position yourself with the Conservatives primarily on growth, well, what happens if growth moves forward? You haven't got another position, so where are the bigger ideas? And I think that's what I would be more excited about. Something that looks like electoral reform, I think, is really important, because so many people are disengaged.
Is that what people are really worried about right now, Denise? People trying to make ends meet. Is electoral reform really what they want?
No, it's not. But you also need to capture people's ideas and give them something. You need something on the front of the bus. And if the issue is, cost of living, then this is what I'm going to do for cost of living. But I'm also going for something that's slightly bigger than just, I can manage the economy better. People want more than just management. They want vision. And I think that's where there is some lacking on.
It's the key word, isn't it? Vision is that key word. It strikes me, Benedict, at the moment on both sides, the Tories and Labour, there is a distinct lack of vision. Today, of Keir Starmer talking about setting up a committee. Rishi Sunak spent the weekend talking about setting up task forces. People of this country have a right to say, we elect these people to solve problems on our behalf. Is this really the best they can do?
Well, I was going to say, this is actually where, Ella was saying that the Tories and Labour are sort of worryingly close together. This is where they are worryingly close together, is that there's no sort of long-term vision, there's no sort of long-term strategy about all the sorts of things that people are worried about in terms of things like growth, but also things like housing, energy policy. Ultimately, there's also no sort of plan about future-proofing for any of the things that have led us into the situation where we currently are. It was not a secret that Russia was, the key supplier of European hydrocarbons. It was not not a secret that we were vulnerable to a pandemic, for example. 8 different strains of different diseases had almost become pandemics in the last 2 decades. That's, that's you can't say that we weren't warned there. It's things like the grain supply. Again, it was not actually a secret that Ukraine was so fundamental to global food supplies. So it's not just things like, how are we going to kickstart growth in this country. It's as much about how do we make sure that when the next thing happens, which it will, be it in China, be it somewhere else in Central Asia, we aren't, sort of quite so vulnerable to these situations. And, then there are the other things, the things that are more close to home, that would kickstart growth and preserve it long term. As I say, things like energy, housing especially, I think is really starting to get people's goat a little bit. And especially on that, I think neither party has any sort of long-term strategy, and people notice these things, and that's where they lose faith in them.
We're going to come on to the Tory leadership race in just a moment. Very briefly, Michael, if you would. What difference do you think Labour would make? Back to you.
Well, I don't think they make any difference, because the last time the Labour government were in, there was no money left. And if you've got millions of people in the country that are fully employed, and you can see the thousands of people that driving nice new cars going to France, nobody seems to be worried about the 10% inflation there. It doesn't seem to be wringing one's hands. I don't think the question's been asked. What specifically is Mr. Carr? What is he going to do to sort out, if he did get into power, to sort out the problems if they're ongoing now?
Okay, Michael, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Got to leave it there. It is 8:20. More of your calls on this coming up. 0345 606093, the number to get your question in to put to our panel. We'll talk about the Tory leadership race in just a moment. 8:20.
This is LBC.
When you
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross question. Tweet at LBC.
8:22 is the time. Let's get straight back to your questions. Christine in Durham asks, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss have both pledged to run positive campaigns. Are we seeing that? Benedict?
I mean, ostensibly from the candidates themselves, yes, they've not said anything that is too prickly. But from behind the scenes, absolutely not, because that's what you have underlings to do, is to throw the grenades for you whilst you stand there looking good. It's a bit unedifying. Neither of them has actually been elected Prime Minister yet, and I'm already thoroughly bored of both administrations. I think that, this is what it's sort of descending into, because ultimately, what it is boiling down to is two candidates who don't really know what they're going to do when they get into power. I know that Liz Truss has got lots of ideas about what she's going to do, but realistically, she has infinitely less experience, certainly when it comes to the financial side, than Rishi Sunak does. It's very easy to sort of waft around the globe, signing trade deals that are basically taken from somebody else with a few little twists and turns here and there. But, I think the very fact that we've got both of them and they are sort of jostling to see who can be more like Thatcher, and I just think that speaks really to the situation that we're in. We've got a political party that is still kowtowing to the memory of a woman who won power almost half a century ago. And because that's going to appeal to Tory members who are also from that decade. And, this is what we say when we talk about a gerontocracy. We're talking about people of a certain generation. They're the ones that will be deciding the Prime Minister. Completely flying in the face, actually, of what most most of the country wants. And what's rather interesting, I think, is given what Boris Johnson did to win the last general election, taking seats away from Labour in former, those so-called red wall seats, working class areas that were completely at the antithesis of everything Margaret Thatcher stood for, why it is they think that this is a fantastic idea to go back to the good old days when, you know, half of the country absolutely loathed the Tories because of Margaret Thatcher. I'm just not sure why. And I think ultimately that's why it's getting a little bit scrappy, because both sides are pretty short on ideas.
Ella, is that part of the Tories' problem here, that the people choosing our next Prime Minister, our next national leaders, 170,000 odd of them, they're totally out of touch with public opinion? Is that a problem for the Tories? Because, as Benedict says, that's surely why Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak are competing to see who can be most like Margaret Thatcher. Liz Truss is literally dressing up as Margaret Thatcher.
Although I think maybe her attempt at wearing Claire, I don't know that Thatcher ever wore Claire's accessories earrings, though I love Claire's accessories and I'm wearing their earrings right now, so I have nothing against them.
Her necklace went for £40,000 at auction.
Yeah,
Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. Was it Claire's accessories?
I don't know, but if it was, that was a good investment.
Maybe that's a point in Rishi's favour, his expensive suit.
There is a process, and, you know, this is the process that we're in, that the Tory members pick the next Prime Minister. You can't complain about that too much.
But it's a ludicrous way of choosing national leaders, isn't it?
But what I'm saying is, you know, that's the process, but there is a more important, a broader question of democracy, which is that the Conservative Party, through deposing Boris Johnson, and whatever about his flaws and the criticism against him, I largely agree with them, have caused a situation in which, you know, the next Prime Minister is pretty much being elected like a pope, like, you know, in a puff of smoke, and the rest of us have to deal with it. They've both ruled out the prospect of a general election. And, you know, Ailbhe was talking about the fact that Keir Starmer's just on step one. Well, we're going to have to wait 3 years, you know, until 2025 to find out what step two is. That's stasis in politics for a very long time. But you know, as much as I think there should be a general election, and I'm not looking forward to, you know, what is it, 160,000, 200,000, whatever the estimate of Conservative Party members is going to pick the next person who's going to deal with the very serious crises we've got going on internationally and nationally in this country. But at the same time, there's been, you know, over the last few days, actually, there's been a kind of real kind of damning indictment of the Tory members as, and, you know, I'm not one myself, but as just kind of like this bunch of bigots who sort of are like so backward that no one wants to engage with them. There's been a slew of articles in the FT and other places saying, you know, we should absolutely outrule the intervention of members in any kind of elections like this. It's terrible. So the instinct of people in politics today is to go backwards in relation to democracy, not forward. It's always to remove power away from these kind of like idiot plebs, whether in the Tory party or indeed the Labour Party had the same round themselves.
It's saying take it away from a small group of unrepresentative party members and broaden it out. Let people sign up so they can vote for the next.
Yeah, well, that I'd be in favour in that kind of move. But actually, most of the narrative at the moment is take it away from the party members and keep it in just basically within MPs themselves. And, you know, the whole, if you really want to know what's going on at the moment, it is a soap opera in SW1, this leadership election. It is completely irrelevant to most people. I mean, Boris Johnson's been in the headlines, you know, in the last few hours saying that he wished that he could wipe away his resignation. There's this petition going around for a significant number of members saying that they wish the same could happen. I think probably lots of people looking at the choice they have at the moment and thinking, you know, this is just all a bad nightmare. I wish it had never happened. And even if you don't have to be the biggest fan of Boris Johnson to have some sympathy with that, I think.
Ailbhe, going back to the question, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss have both pledged to run positive campaigns. Are we seeing that? I would suggest we are seeing something very, very different. We've seen them tearing chunks off each other. How damaging does that have the potential to be for the Tory party as a whole? Because after all this is over, of course, they're going to have to come back together.
Yeah, and I think the Conservative Party is not just looking a bit sort of grumpy at the moment, it's looking tired. And I think, you know, that's a symptom of being in government for a very, very long time, very successfully under different leaders, shape-shifting, reinventing itself. Boris Johnson going for, you know, another term, this old Conservative government, and presenting it like it was a fresh start, saying, you know, oh, all these problems that I've just identified, all these like underfunded hospitals and, well, you know, cuts to police, I'll reverse it, I'll turn that around, I'm a fresh start. But it was the same government. I think it's only now that really the Conservative Party is feeling that tiredness from being in government for so long. But it's really, I mean, this is quite a nasty contest. It's really the first time that this malaise that I think has been going on in the Tory party for a while is sort of coming to the surface. I mean, I remember being at Tory party conference in October, Boris Johnson was still really, really popular at that stage. He was really at the height of his powers. And it was so strange because he did this conference speech. I don't know if you all remember it, but he essentially said nothing. It was just sort of like feel good and a joke about Michael Gove getting sweaty in some nightclub in Glasgow.
I remember that speech. You got like a rock star welcome. And a year later and he's gone.
Boris Johnson, the rock star. And it was just so strange because he was so popular. The membership, all the councillors, MPs, completely behind him. But if you actually engage them in conversation, even then, people were really unhappy that Rishi Sunak was putting up taxes. And people saying, well, it's great that we're in power, it's great that we got this slumping majority, but we're not really doing conservative things with it. And sort of people feeling a bit uncomfortable with that. And it's only really now that they're getting to have the debate about really whether that's everything that they want to be doing. And you're seeing this split between Rishi Sunak's interpretation of what conservatism is for now on the one hand versus Liz Truss on the other. It's really, really bitter. I think loads of Conservatives have been really, really unhappy with Rishi Sunak's tax increases to fund the debt accrued over the pandemic. I think it will leave them really, really bruised. And then there's just this legacy of the fact that Boris Johnson has been hobbled. Some people in the membership are really, really unhappy about that. They're not going to get over that quickly.
Denise, what have you made of the race so far?
I personally haven't. I was enjoying it in the early parts of the race because there was a real collection of different candidates. I mean, they were all cut from the same cloth in terms of, access, opportunity in that regard. But it was good to see that, and I felt that, to me, that was interesting. Whereas now, I mean, I'm not overly enthused about either of the two candidates because I think, essentially, Liz Truss is just continuity Boris, and she's the ERG candidate, whereas Rishi is seen as something slightly fresh, but he's not really going to deviate too much because he's going down the same route as what's expected. But I think in terms of the question, is there going to be a nasty campaign? I think you're going to see that more and more the closer you get to the 5th of September, because they both want to win and they're only going to say the things that are going to resonate with the membership. And on the one hand, I don't think you should be removing democracy from local groups, because that's what associations are. They're local community groups. They are volunteers as well. They do it voluntarily and they have a political engagement, but they are not a representative group of the whole population. And I think that is why the question is, should we engage in that way? So I think there's also a question about the ideas issue. There isn't much coming out from either of two candidates that says to me, they've got any big ideas. And they don't, I don't think.
Continue this in just a moment. 0345 60 973, the number to call to put your question to our panel. First, though, time now, 8:31. Let's get some news headlines. Andy Ailbhe.
Former Northern Ireland First Minister Lord Trimble has died at the age of 77 following an illness. He helped broker the Good Friday Agreement and jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize with the SDLP leader John Hume. Sport Scotland will meet leaders of at least 25 governing bodies tomorrow to discuss the findings of a damning report into racism within Cricket Scotland. The national agency is keen to ensure other sports are doing all they can to tackle the issue. The Goodfellas actor Paul Sorvino has died at the age of 83. He played Paul Cicero in the classic 1990 crime film alongside Robert De Niro and Ray Liotta. LBC weather, tonight showers mostly drying out, tomorrow dry in most parts with sunny spells. A few light showers across Scotland, northern and eastern England, a high of 23 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
8:34 the time. You're listening to LBC. Me, Ben Kentish, in for Ian Dale. Joining me in the studio for Cross Question this evening are Ailbhe Rea, host of the Westminster Insider podcast, Denise Headley, the broadcaster and commentator, Benedict Spence, political commentator and journalist, and also Ella Whelan, columnist for Spiked Online. 0345 6060 973, the number to call if you want to ask our panel a question tonight. Jason in Surrey, stepping away from the Tory leadership contest just for a moment, asks, why did Brexit supporting ministers not foresee customs and visa requirements? This is, of course, I would think, in relation to the chaos we've seen in Dover over the weekend. This is, Ella, exactly what the Remain campaign warned us would happen, is it not?
Yeah, but come on now. The Remain campaign said that basically, and you know, particularly ardent Remainers who couldn't accept the result of the vote afterwards, just use the B word for anything that goes wrong. You know, if it rains, it's Brexit's fault. If it, you know, anything that goes wrong, it's Brexit's fault.
But these checks that are being delayed, they are only necessary because we've left the EU. Brexit is a direct consequence. This is a direct consequence of Brexit.
Indeed, and you know, I think we should hold the government responsible for not being able to handle a significant change in process. I mean, it's just fundamental. You don't have to be a Brexit hater to understand that if you change a system and you change rules and regulations, you're going to have to be able to deal with that. And the Conservative government hasn't been able to deal with that. And I say that as a passionate Brexiteer who was very invested in the process of and the spirit and dream of reclaiming democracy, reclaiming sovereignty, and all those things that was the meat of Brexit. But you know, the thing about that, there's been a kind of a slightly ridiculous conversation about particularly what's going on in Dover at the moment. You know, on the one hand, it's very clear that there is some fundamental issues, just practical things like not having enough resources. Dover being, you know, a place that the route into it is sort of like lots of tiny roads, you know, things that have been a problem for a very long time. It's also true that there's lots of sort of Ramonas, as they're rather unfortunately called, on Twitter, seem to forget that you did have to do things like get things stamped and get, you know, identity and passports checked and things like that before Brexit. You know, we didn't just sort of like float into France. There was a process beforehand. But I think what we have to look at is what has happened post-Brexit. And I think from the political angle to the kind of practical angle, there has been no sort of, there have been very few benefits in terms of the government has squandered all the positive aspects that those of us who voted to leave the European Union in 2016.
Brexit, and you think at this point in time we've got very little to show for it in the way of benefits?
Because the whole point of what, you know, if you look at what Brexiteers were arguing for, it was taking back control of that famous phrase of borders, of politics, of democracy, of laws. And, you know, you've got basically you've had a government that has wanted to play footsie with the European Union for the last few years. You know, no matter the rhetoric about kind of like being strong and being sort of strident with them, we still are sort of hampered by regulation. If you look at things like the Northern Ireland Protocol, that's been a very unsatisfactory situation. You know, if you look at things like the thing I was most excited about, which was the spirit of democracy, the idea that politics was going to come back into the hands of the every man and woman because of the way in which removing our relationship with the European Union would make our politicians more accountable. You have a government that, you know, comes along in 2019 and says, we're going to have that Brexit spirit, levelling up and blah, blah, blah. And then you have a pandemic, you know, 2 years of a pandemic where Boris Johnson forgets every single libertarian bone in his body, attacks civil liberties, is really down on democracy, emergency legislation is brought in, and it's very clear that they wouldn't know what Brexit means if it, you know, hit them over the head. So that I'm not regretful, by the way.
Why not, though? I was going to ask you to say that, because you say, look, it's 6 years since the vote. We haven't got any benefits to show for it in your view, and yet you still think it was the right thing to do.
Because Brexit wasn't a policy question, and it was not a question that was reducible to does the border work at Dover. It was about something far more fundamental, which is what none of the politicians at the moment seem to understand, which is that the people who voted in that referendum, many of whom it was for the first time in their entire lives, never mind their political lives, it was about saying something fundamental about the every man and woman's ability to have a say in politics. And I think that is, you know, there has been nothing greater in British politics in my lifetime, and certainly in many, many decades, than that powerful assertion of sovereignty from ordinary working class people.
Okay, Ella, is Ella right, Denise, that Ramonas, to use her word, are far too quick to blame everything?
Not my word, you know.
You used it. You used it. You said regrettably, and then used it nonetheless. Too quick to blame Brexit. Brexit for everything that goes wrong in this country?
I think the whole debate where we descended into this very polarised conversation was damaging to the country as a whole anyway. The issue is now Brexit it's not done, but it's a work in progress. And quite frankly, that work in progress hasn't yielded the dividends. And what's happening at Dover is an example of that. Also, I think if you remember back at Christmas, we had a whole range of animals being slaughtered because we don't have the workers coming in. We have got labour shortages. And these things, irrespective of the idea that, we were taking back control of our monies, borders and laws, hasn't actually materialised for the ordinary person. Part of the Brexit dividend was supposed to be that we were going to have, tremendous trade deals. And I think I retweeted today a video that basically was saying that we weren't going to have any problems at Dover. Well, that's clearly not the case. So I think for people, I didn't vote for Brexit. I'm sure you worked that out. But we are here now. But therefore,
I'd never have guessed.
Yeah, but therefore, how do we move forward in a way that is no longer polarising and divisive? And I don't think we're at that point in the conversation yet, because too many people are seeing examples of what we saw in Dover. So, there is a real failure of policy in my view.
Benedict, on that, Ella might say it's because the government has messed it up. But Denise is right to say that the problems that we're now seeing, those that backed remaining warned about them, and those that backed leave weren't saying this. Yes, of course there'll be queues at Dover. Yes, there'll be staffing shortages.
Some people said that. Some people, if you choose to believe a politician who tells you literally everything will be gumdrops and rainbows, well, that's a you problem. But actually, not everybody was saying Brexit would be
Which
fantastic.
Brexiteers were saying you'd have to queue for 7 hours?
I'm not really going to go through. I mean, I for a start didn't believe it was all going to be fantastic. Sadly, I wasn't in any sort of position to influence the thing. But it was always very much my position that Brexit was a catalyst. It wasn't a sort of a good thing or a bad thing. It is what you make.
Catalyst for what?
It is what you make of it. It is entirely dependent on what governments you get afterwards. And I think what Ella says is very important. It was about taking back control. There was a sense in this country that things didn't improve, they didn't get fixed, they didn't, when something went wrong, you'd write to your MP and they'd say, oh, well, I'd love to do something about that, but that's Europe's remit and there's nothing we can do and it's just going to have to stay the same, it's going to have to atrophy, and this is just the way of the world. And I think that's what really irked a lot of people, and so they voted for something that would give, they thought, their politicians more control. And now when you have problems at the border, you have lots of people saying, oh, well, this is all Brexit's fault. I think the attitude of a lot of people is, well, go on then, fix it, increase capacity, come to some sort of agreement with France on the other side. But certainly I would have thought increasing capacity, as Ella said, these queues, I've been stuck in queues at Dover for 18 hours before, for long before Brexit happened. This is not a new thing because it's a natural bottleneck, and almost all of our sort of vehicle, car traffic goes through there if it wants to get on the ferry, if it wants to go to that part of France. It's not a surprise. This was always going to have to be something that was sorted out anyway. As population increases, as more and more people use the resources, you are going to have to increase capacity. Oh no. Get on with it. Do it. Spend the money. Don't just sit there going, oh, well, if only Brexit hadn't happened, everything would have been fine. It doesn't really work that way. In much the same way as beforehand, everybody was saying, oh, well, if only we weren't part of the European Union, we wouldn't be having these problems. And I think, really, that's the way you've got to look at it. You can sit here and you can say, isn't it dreadful that, that we didn't quite get the Brexit we wanted? The point is, the voters gave the politicians instructions. They said, it's no longer the case that it's acceptable that you can just sit on your hands and not improve things. This is a wake-up call. And Ella's completely right. None of the political elites in this country actually seem to have grasped that. They all have different ideas of what Brexit seems to be, none of which seems to involve taking back control.
Ailbhe, is this the fault of the politicians or is this the fault of those that voted to leave? Was this always inevitable, whatever happened?
Well, I think on the very basic point, I suppose that without wanting to undo all the progress we've made looking forward. I think it is just a fact that it used to be that you just had your passport looked at, going over to France, and now your passport needs to be stamped. It's a material change. It's more faff essentially. It's not that I take your point. It's not like people floated across the border before, but there are more checks. And that's just a sort of basic reality, whether you're okay with that or not. And I think that the heat could be taken out of that. That the people who voted for Brexit are happy for that to be another bit of friction when you go into France or back from France. But I think, on the wider point, I mean, I think Jason's question is such a good one because essentially none of us can really answer it. Why didn't ministers foresee customs checks and visa requirements and build capacity to deal with it? I don't have a good answer for you. I wish you had a politician on.
They called them Project Fear. When these sorts of warnings were made, Ella, they said this is Project Fear. It's not going to happen.
No, one of the things that you have to go rewind back and stick your head in 2016 and remember that at the time we were being told that I think it was David Cameron or someone said that if you vote for Brexit and if this happens, there will be economic catastrophe. The world will end.
Okay, that was
all
exaggerated.
That kind of stuff.
But they also said that travel will get more difficult.
I think
and it has.
But I think look, the economy's in the doldrums. I mean, that no one's saying that there has been that as Benedict put it, kind of gumdrops and rainbows and sunny uplands. But the question comes down to which would you have preferred? Because if you rewind back to 2016, the narrative that you had was change with the possibility of risk, and actually Brexiteers soaked up that possibility of risk and made that educated decision. Or what the Remain campaign was arguing was actually fairly negative. You remember, it was saying we know the European Union's pretty awful. They're pretty awful on immigration. We don't like this about them. We don't like that about them. We know it's not great. We know the country's not in a good place, but just don't change anything. And I am still invigorated by the fact that millions of people in this country voted for some kind of change, for a shake-up. I think catalyst is a good word for it. But it's also the fact that, you in situations where you can't let the European Union off the hook even now. I mean, Ailbhe talks about the fact that Brexiteers are happy to, deal with friction. Actually, that's not necessarily true. I mean, part of the problems with, if you look over in Ireland and in relation to what's going on with the Northern Ireland Protocol and regulations, the kind of war of regulations there. Okay. You have the European Union stipulating that you have to follow these rules, which to most people on the ground sound absolutely ridiculous.
Paul's tweeted, Ben, respect to your Brexit supporting panellists calling a spade here, but we did very much float into France before. I worked for a company with a common parent in France, and we were lucky enough to be able to visit them regularly on the company private jet. Well, that's one way. That's one way to get past the Dover chaos.
Might I just say though, we're talking very specifically about one case, Dover, and getting into France, where it's actually very politically expedient to bash the Anglos. If you try to get into Lisbon or Porto or Prague or Linate, actually nothing really has changed.
But that's because it's a road. That's because it's a road border.
But it's not the case, is it, that all travel into the European Union has got worse? In many cases, actually, because the queues are shorter, because you have your own special queue, it's a lot easier.
Okay. Coming up, we'll speak to Jake in Largs in just a moment on mental health care. He'll put his questions to the panel. 0345 6060 973 if you want to do the same. It's 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
The NHS facing the greatest workforce crisis in its history. A report released by a group of MPs, chaired by former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt. Why might the numbers be even greater than your report contains?
We're about 12,000 doctors short, 50,000 nurses short. You can't solve these problems overnight, but what they want is a plan, and we haven't had that. Instead, we've been going backwards, and you can throw all the money you want in the world at the NHS, but if you haven't got the professionals there to do the operations, then you're not going to get the result you want.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
10 to 9 the call. Let's go straight to Jake in Scotland for his question. Jake, you're on the radio, sir. What did you want to ask?
Hi, Ben. Thank you. I want to ask a very, very simple question. Does the panel think that any future government will fund mental health services as part of the NHS as properly as they should do, bearing in mind that historically mental health services have been woefully neglected?
Denise?
The short answer is no. I don't think they would fund it to that level of capacity, because I think the questions around mental health are very important. But in terms of them really addressing it for things such as CAMHS, I don't think you're going to see that. I mean, I was listening on the radio today. I think there's a new initiative that started out, and it's basically it's a house where people can go if you've got issues around, suicide. But there's one. It's one. And there just isn't enough capacity in the system. And I don't think, because that group also don't vote, especially if you're looking at young people, not that they don't vote, but they're not seen as a voting bloc that policymakers pitch to, then I think that's going to be an issue, because I think the issue around young people and mental health is huge, but also the issue around mental health for older people is a big issue, but it's not going to get the funding. So no is the short answer.
Do you feel like things are getting better, Denise, even if not quickly enough or not significantly enough? Is it going at least in the right direction?
I think there's more debate, there's more conversation, and I think more people are aware, especially post-pandemic, because of the impact of mental health and exclusion and isolation. So yes, I think the conversation has changed. Culturally we've changed, but it's not matched with policy and money, because you need money and you also need the infrastructure to support that locally, and I think that's lacking.
Ailbhe, it's not really on the political agenda at the moment, isn't it? The government's not really talking about it. The Tory leadership contest candidates aren't really talking about it. Labour's not really talking about it. It affects millions of people. Shouldn't politicians be paying a bit more attention?
Yes, I think it's a good question, and I think they will have to start paying attention to it, really for a cynical reason, that this intersects so much with problems around NHS capacity. And we've been talking about the economy and growth a lot on this show already, and stress and mental health issues are one of the biggest contributors to workplace absences at the moment. Stress, depression, mental illnesses are a major cause of GP visits at the moment, and I think that it was really, I suppose, on the mental health prevention side of things and building mental health resilience and resources at that end. I think it's a little bit like our obesity strategy. I think preventing these things before they get to the point where they're incredibly serious, really difficult for the people who have to access these services, people turning up at A&E. I think preventing it getting to that point is something that is just going to be inevitable on a policy level. But I do sort of worry about what will have to happen before the conversation really shifts that way. I think that, just from being a journalist and reporting, people have terrible experiences of trying to access mental health services at different points along the system and not really getting the support that they need. People are really, really struggling to get in touch with GPs at the moment. Everyone knows that. GPs are often the first point of contact for people with mental health problems. So I think that I'm a little bit worried on the news today. We're hearing about epidemic levels of mental ill health among young people, a rise in eating disorders, anxiety, depression, because of the social isolation that Denise talked about. And I just sort of wonder what news story is going to happen that means that suddenly we're talking about this on your show and suddenly politicians are paying attention to it, and then we sort of realise where this is chronically underfunded.
Benedict?
I mean, we talk a lot about especially young people and mental conditions, especially things like depression and burnout. But actually, the thing that sort of really interests me or concerns me is far more serious. Not to say that they aren't serious, but things like psychosis, things like very serious mental conditions that actually end up with people as wards of the state. They end up with people in the prison system. And actually the sheer scale of people who are in the prison system, who have committed crimes, violent crimes, who actually what they really need is psychiatric help and intervention before it gets to that stage. And I think we'll talk about this as we are doing now in terms of young people, working age people, productivity, that sort of thing. I think that's when it will start to really hit home, if it starts to affect things like productivity. X many people are taking time off work because they just can't function. But actually, I think that there's a sort of a dark underside to all of this, which is that there are as I say again, not to downplay the severity of things like depression, which can be incredibly destructive, but there are people with far more serious mental conditions who, we're not even talking about them actually getting access to treatment. They are literally just picked up by the police and they go to prison, and that's their lot. And so I think we can't just talk about this in terms of young people getting access to mental health services. We need to talk about the effects that this has on things like crime and the knock-on effects that it has to other aspects of communities as well.
Ella, why isn't this higher up the political agenda? Why don't we talk about it more? Why don't politicians talk about it more?
I think actually politicians, do talk about mental health a lot, but the thing that happens is that it gets talked about in these very vast, broad, kind of flabby ways, which is that people throw in, the question of stress and anxiety, which actually for most people, particularly, I know this from years ago working in schools, is a common complaint of your average student. I've got anxiety, I've got stress, and actually, what they have is an unwillingness to do their homework. I'm trying to be unsympathetic and flippant here.
A lot of people who say that will have stress-related illnesses, and they will have anxiety.
Of course, extreme stress can lead to mental breakdowns, and that's something very serious. But what I'm trying to point out is that we have conversations about mental health as if, we have discussions about everybody has mental health, everybody is in some way on the spectrum. And in practice, what that ends up doing is you kind of broaden out the question of mental health so that you can't, as Benedict says, be specific and give attention to resources where they are specifically needed, whether that is in relation to, looking at the fact that there are asking serious questions about why huge numbers of young people are currently now on antidepressants. Why on earth is that happening? Rather than just saying, oh, it's mental health and isn't it great that everyone's being treated, asking the question of what's going on here, whether or not all those people need to be on antidepressants. And I think part of the thing that, with discussions about mental health in the NHS is that we're sort of unwilling to have honest conversations about why these things might be caused. So you have politicians scratching their heads as to why there's a kind of mental health crisis on the horizon at the moment. None of them willing to say, do you think maybe it was because we instituted policies that locked people in their homes for 2 years? Do you think maybe it might have been our fault?
It's long preceded that. It's been evolving.
But it has exploded since then.
The pandemic has massively exacerbated it because we know human beings are social animals. We have to interact with each other. And that if anybody was on the brink of some kind of mental health illness, whether it was serious or not, locking them in their house, keeping them from work, making it illegal, being harassed by the police for sitting on a bench with someone is certainly not going to be good for it.
Denise, briefly, do you want to come back on that?
Only essentially to say that I think, the question around mental health has been broadened, but I think the fact is that more people are experiencing it at all stratas of our society, from very young people to quite mature people. So I think that's the reason why you're getting a lot more conversation about it. I just like to see the relatable infrastructure and the money attached to it.
OK, last question from Diana in Southend. Swindon has ruled themselves out of hosting the Eurovision Song Contest. Where should be hosting it? Benedict?
Liverpool.
I was going to say
Best night out.
Best night out. Denise, Liverpool too.
I was going to say Liverpool because I think it's such a historic place.
I was seeing a lot of support today for Cardiff.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Ailbhe, Belfast, is that on the cards?
Pitch for Belfast, yeah.
Anywhere, Ella?
I know it's really unpopular, but there is a huge Ukrainian population in Newham in London. No one wants to have it in London because everyone's like, oh, London gets everything. But it is true that some of the best Ukrainian food you can get, I mean, not in the country because I haven't done a tour of Ukrainian restaurants, but, is in Newham. There are loads of Ukrainians in Newham, so I think possibly that needs to be taken into consideration.
Ian Dale would be very happy if it was Norfolk. He could literally probably walk there. Hey guys, thank you very, very much to our panel tonight. Thank you for your texts, tweets and questions, your calls on that. Coming up after the news, we're going to be talking about something we've just touched on, mental health. As a cage fighter speaks out about his friend's suicide, I'm asking you, how big a problem is men's failure, men's struggle with opening up and talking about their feelings? It's causing an epidemic of male suicide in this country and much of the developing world. Let's talk about it. What can we do about it? And what is the underlying cause? How do we encourage men to speak more about their feelings and stop this problem getting any worse than it already is?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom.